It is 8 after 4. So far this year, there have been 46 fatalities on regional roads in WA. That is 13 more deaths than last year already, and we're not even halfway through. 5 Australian states are currently trialling 30 kilometre per hour speed limits in cities and near schools. But what's the deal with 30 kilometres per hour? Does it actually reduce fatalities or at least a chance of injury? University of Newcastle PhD candidate Teppy McLaughlin joins us now. He's co-authored a paper discussing some common myths about 30 kilometre speed limits. Good afternoon, Teppy.
Hey Stan, how are you?
I'm very good. 30 kilometres per hour, do they actually help save lives?
They absolutely do, yeah. There's international evidence from all over the world that shows that when we lower the speed limit, we increase the chance of the pedestrian surviving a crash against a car.
There's often discussion about slower speeds meaning increasing travel time, but your paper seems to suggest that change would be negligible. What do you mean?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and there's a lot of kind of common myths about 30 kilometres, and perhaps, quite understandably, people are a little bit concerned about lowering speed limits. But the one around journey times is quite an interesting one. It seems to be other factors that are involved when it comes to our total journey time. So say take about a 25-minute typical journey to work. It's only less than a minute difference when you introduce 30 kilometre an hour zones around schools and around houses where we live and on our streets that we shop on. So that's mainly because we don't spend a lot of time driving on those kind of roads.
Yeah.
But they're exactly the kind of places we want people to be rather than necessarily lots of car traffic.
Some people might say a minute is a minute too long. I don't have time for this, Teppy.
Yeah, well, to be precise, it's 48 seconds from the study that was cited. It's one of those things, when we consider it against the balance of risk, we take a lot of risk when we go out on the roads. The facts that you were pulling up there, I find that quite astounding, the number of deaths that we're getting in Australia. And we know that speed is the number one contributor to road trauma, more so than things like alcohol use or drunk driving or fatigue driving. We know that speed is the most common contributor.
Obviously, when we talk about 30 kilometres per hour, we're not talking about highways and freeways. We're talking more like, what are we talking, like suburban areas around schools?
Yeah, it's interesting, Stan, because we're talking about streets that we don't necessarily do a lot of our driving on, but that we spend a lot of time kind of milling around in. And so that's our school zones and our residential streets. So if you're living in a suburb and you're down a cul-de-sac, the default urban speed limit at the minute is 50, and that's too fast. We know that if you get hit at 50, you've got a 90% chance of dying, but if you get hit at 30, you've only got a 10% chance.
Yeah.
I think, interestingly, though, Stan, there's another thing here, and safety is one thing, but livability is the other. And, it's a bit of a stretch for people to get their head around this one quickly, but livability is around making places nice for people to spend time in. And if you've got a fast road rushing through your town centre, maybe, you're in Kalgoorlie and the road speed's fast through the town centre, you're not necessarily going to want to cross the road and go to that other shop or have a coffee in the cafe on the street. And if we look at cities around the world that are increasing livability, they're also bringing speed down on their local streets.
Teppy McLaughlin, my guest, he's from the University of Newcastle. He's co-authored a paper discussing some common myths about 30 kilometre per hour speed limits, and of course it is Road Safety Week here in WA. Do you think that would you say that most Australians are in favour of slower speed limits? I mean, and is there any divide between, say, folks in the metropolitan areas and folks in regional Australia?
The last part of your question, I haven't got data to hand on, but in terms of Australians as a whole, it's very few people dislike massively. That's from a recent Heart Foundation poll. So we found that 2/3 of people in a nationally representative poll would be in support of lowering the speed limits on local streets. And I think the latter third are kind of questioning rather than, there are obviously some people very much against this. And to some extent, that's because there are these myths that are flying around in terms of they don't make a difference, they don't save lives, or, they'll increase my journey times, or they're anti-motorist, or, it's just so the government can get more fines. These are the kind of things that are myths, and we've debunked those in our article published in The Conversation today. So I would encourage anybody, if they are kind of thinking, I'm not really sure about all of this 30Ks stuff, just go and have a quick look at that article, and you'll see that the arguments are really there for 30Ks. It is a win-win-win. It's good for motorists. It can actually cut congestion because people feel more comfortable to go on those short journeys by foot or by bike. If it's a longer journey, they're still going by car, but they're taking roads that aren't 30Ks. These are local roads that we're talking about that we want to change to 30 kilometres an hour. So actually, overall journey time doesn't change. So there's all sorts of myths floating around, but we found that 2/3 of Australians are in support and very few are firmly against.
Yeah, well worth a look. Is that article quite comprehensive? We've heard today that the town of Subiaco in Perth is they've been trialling 30 kilometre per hour speed limits, and they've decided that they are here to stay in Subiaco. Of course, there are other trials around Australia. Are the trials working? Are they showing good results?
I would like to say that Western Australia is doing an absolutely fantastic job, and that is because they're also doing not just the speed limits, but some of the other stuff which is around building and designing our streets, or even modifying our existing roads to calm traffic. So you might have seen some of the safe active streets if you're knocking around in Perth. Subiaco has got one. There's some in Riverdale. And these kind of streets are slowing traffic down in neighbourhoods by introducing certain features such as road narrowing in certain places, red Shalama road layouts instead of grey. That can help us feel as though we're in a slow neighbourhood. And there's all sorts of nice little things that Western Australia are doing that go beyond just the speed limits. And I think the combination of things here is what's important. The speed limit's one thing, enforcement's another, but also building and designing streets that are there to calm traffic.
I'll put this to you before I let you go. Steve writes, we don't want to go to 30 kilometre per hour speed limits around houses. It's about education. I was taught to cross the road when I was 4. 40 is slow enough. We need to increase highway limits to 130 everywhere, like in the Northern Territory, as it shortens your trip, so less chance of fatigue. Do these people know how big our country is? Right, Steve. There's a bit in there to unpack, but your comment?
There's plenty in there, of course. I think it's a really interesting argument that, quite a few people have shared with me. I think the one key thing that cuts with them, if you can try to explain that it is a negligible difference, if any, when you introduce 30Ks, but it is in terms of road, the time you spend on the road, your journey time. But in terms of safety, you go from a 10% chance of surviving if you get hit at 50, and a 60% chance of surviving at 40, to a 90% chance at 30. So it is a massive difference. I would never dream of letting kids play out on the street in a 50 kilometre an hour residential area, but I would help supervise and go out and play on the street if it was 30Ks. And I think the education point that he made is a very good one, and we have some education campaigns running in Australia around road safety. I'm based in New South Wales, and we have Towards Zero here, and you might see some billboards. I'm not entirely sure what the campaign is in WA at the moment, but there are education campaigns. That is one part of the puzzle, but the other part is speed limits, another part is enforcement, and the final part is kind of building and modifying existing roads to calm traffic.
Teppy, we'll leave it there. Before I let you go, do you have a personalised number plate you want to share with us? You got one? You seen one?
I was listening to you talking about this. Yeah, I have seen a couple. You'll hear it in my voice. I'm British, and I have seen a couple of Brit 1 or Brit 2s flying around. Yeah, so I might try and get myself one of those when I head back over to WA.
Or Brit 3, because 1 and 2's taken.
That's right.
Nice to talk to you, Teppy. Thank you for sharing your findings.
Dan.
Teppy McLaughlin there. He is a PhD candidate from the University of Newcastle. So what do you think? Is it time to introduce more broadly 30 kilometre hour speed limits, particularly around suburbs and schools? Okay, 30 kilometres around suburbs and schools in towns and regional WA.